When I first read this anonymous quote, I was struck with awe. It haunted me for months. It felt so true, so accurate in simplicity. But acknowledging this truth was not enough. Since reading this quote, I devoted countless of my precious thinking hours to recognizing and analyzing what conditions led to this reality. When I was first brainstorming my arguments, I tried to define myself in the categories that were carved out by the theoreticians of the past. Just warism, anti-warism, pacifism. The writings that followed were what is to be expected from a 400-level philosophy course. Logical, concise arguments that supported my thesis. But I wasn't satisfied. The work that I had done felt empty and inadequate. I wrestled with this dilemma for some time. It occurred to me to apply a truth that I'd come to find accurate in every dilemma one encounters in life. That is, one cannot fix a problem while occupying the same state of mind during which the problem was created. So I strived to address the problem of war from a more practical perspective. And eventually, when I took a step back and viewed war as a system, and examined its moving parts, the root of my dilemma was plain as day. I realized that I was dissatisfied because my personal theories about the rightness and wrongness of any given war simply don't matter. Disapproval of a war waged by my state will not prevent my state from engaging in that war. Even disapproval by the majority of citizens in a given state is not enough to prevent that state from engaging in war. So this line of thought led me to ask a different set of questions, such as who, if not the citizens, hold the power in deciding when a nation goes to war? And even more importantly, how do these individuals stand to benefit from engaging in warfare? I believe that answering these questions will shed light on our purpose. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to address the power structures of the United States of America. As the United States has, since the Cold War, been a country that has extensively utilized foreign policies of intervention. And also because this is the country in which I live, making me a cog in the machine of these structures. I plan to explore complex topics that include concepts not necessarily universally defined. Groups that exist abstractly. So before I get into my reasoning, I will first clarify some of the language that I'll be using throughout this talk. When I speak of traditional war, I refer to state versus state war, such as the Vietnam War. When I speak of non-traditional war, I refer to initiatives that are warlike but do not satisfy the state versus state criterion of traditional war. Examples of non-traditional war include the war on drugs and the war on terror. When I speak of the corporate aristocracy, I refer to the CEOs, board members, and other high-ranking corporate executives who fund the majority of US federal elections. Individuals such as the Walton family, or members of the executive board of Monsanto, make up the corporate aristocracy. I will use other terms throughout my arguments, but by providing working definitions of these concepts now, I believe I can iron out most confusion at the source. Who decides when the United States goes to war? Technically, Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution declares, Congress shall have power to declare war. But since the close of World War II, it has become habit of U.S. presidents to utilize military intervention previous to congressional approval, usually citing clear and present danger, with no time for congressional vote. Constitutional scholars disagree over the specific powers allotted to the president and Congress in engaging in war, but it is understood that the power lies between the two. With that in mind, I will demonstrate how the marriage between the government with the bourgeoisie has pervaded the economic base of the United States, leading to political formations that guarantee perpetual war in the superstructure. My argument is based upon several assertions. First, as both Marx and Engels have described in detail throughout their many texts, most recognizably the Communist Manifesto, the sole imperative of the corporate aristocracy is to hoard wealth. It does so systematically and without remorse. A group of driven individuals operating in tandem as a sociopathic monster, guided by an insatiable quest for capital. This quest for capital leads the bourgeoisie to expand its markets all over the globe, over mountains, past borders, across seas and into foreign lands. And when the bourgeoisie realized that its control over government was deep enough such that they could get away with occupying foreign lands, raping the landscape of its resources, and using the native peoples as dependent, impoverished wage slaves, we were introduced to the scourge of imperialism. It's also the period when the concept of race was introduced by the bourgeoisie as a justification for empire building, a category that has poisoned much of human interaction that's come to follow. Thankfully, the era of imperialism has ended, largely due to an increased awareness, a higher consciousness, if you will, among those who have been imperialized. After World War I, the call for colonial independence became strong across the globe, particularly in places like Ireland and India. In a perfect example of counter-hegemony deconstructing capitalist hypocrisy, in order to save face and maintain legitimacy on the world stage, imperialist states have since broken most of their colonial ties. It is important to note that these nations were only given independence when the potential backlash from the international community outweighed the immediate benefits of maintaining control of the colonies. The point being, the capitalist imperial states only sacrificed power over the colonies when the cost-benefit analysis led them to believe that it was in their interest to do so. But as imperialist systems were abandoned in the mid-20th century, the bourgeoisie was forced to look to new avenues of exploitation. They were challenged with the task of proposing a more permanent way of providing fiscal dope to their junkie veins. They looked back at the bustling and thriving industry that was embodied at home during the World War II years. It is typical for the industry of a nation to upturn during a time of war, as there is a much greater amount of wealth being pumped into the private sector by the government. The massively wealthy arms manufacturers and military contractors decided to capitalize on this reality by lobbying politicians to expand spending on military and defense. So after a short-lived plummet of military spending after World War II, it has been on the rise ever since. The US consistently tops itself for world record military spender, budgeting over $900 billion to defense in 2011. This yearly hemorrhage of tax dollars into the hands of US military contractors has been coined as the military-industrial complex. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first to use the term in his farewell address in 1961, warning the nation of the cozy relationship between politicians, private military contractors, and national armed forces. Despite his warning, however, the military-industrial complex has grown to astronomical proportions and has yet to hit its peak. The military-industrial complex is a modern manifestation of the long tradition of exploitation by the bourgeoisie, the same tradition that has been responsible for both American chattel slavery and imperialism. Instead of enslaving a population, simply open a factory in a country with little to no labor standards, and pay the people slave wages to produce goods. Instead of colonizing a land to exploit its resources, simply make up an excuse to invade the country, and once it's conquered, you can sell its resources to US corporations. Don't believe me? To put a face to this theory, I will explore a specific example from the Iraq War. Vice President Dick Cheney was the CEO of Halliburton, one of the world's largest oil field corporations, until he signed on as George W. Bush's running mate for the 2000 election. 3 years later, when we infiltrated Iraq, Halliburton was the sole bidder on a $7 billion contract to make emergency repairs to Iraq's oil infrastructure. However, Halliburton not only made repairs to the oil infrastructure, their role also included operation of Iraqi oil fields and distribution of Iraqi oil. So not only was this contract void of competition, as Halliburton was the only company allowed to make a bid on the work, it effectively gave Halliburton, a United States corporation, whose former CEO was then vice president of our nation, control of Iraqi oil fields. One might wonder why no one made a big stink over this mess. Well, Bunatine H. Greenhouse, a top Army contracting official, did. And right at the same time when she was making this stink, she was demoted, and the vice president was never charged, let alone questioned about his conflict of interest. These, along with countless other examples, and certainly countless more that we will never know about, are the types of shady interactions that embody our government's marriage to the corporate aristocracy. My second assertion is that monetary donations by the corporate aristocracy are the single most important element in gaining political office in the United States. In a vast majority of cases, American elections go to the candidate who spends the most on their campaign. To illustrate this truth, between the years 2000 and 2010, 93% of House of Representatives elections were won by the highest spender, and 83% of Senate elections were won by the highest spender. The House of Representatives and the Senate are composed of career politicians who rely on campaign funding for re-election. But the corporate aristocracy funds only the politicians who are willing to advance the interests of the super wealthy elite. This leads politicians, whose sole concern is theoretically with the welfare of the nation, to act instead in favor of powerful special interests. Though the purpose of this talk is to analyze the systems in US politics that lead to war, the invasion of corporate aristocracy into our democracy is also the means by which politicians approve tens of billions of dollars in subsidies for oil giants, despite their making record profits, while denying exponentially less expensive legislation, providing medical benefits to veterans and 9/11 first responders. This invasion is also what allows 2/3 of all corporations to pay effectively zero federal taxes, while teachers pay upwards of 1/3 of their income to the government. When presented with these figures, most Americans would be unsure how a system with such beneficial intentions could become so flawed. But the cause of this inequity is plain as day. Our elected officials are sold to the highest bidder. My third assertion is that on the world stage, the goal of every state is to increase its own influence. At the international level, states act pseudo-anarchically in their dealings with one another. States have governance through international NGOs such as the United Nations, but the resolutions of these organizations are binding only insofar as nations are willing to comply. Moral arguments do not generally factor into a capitalist state's decision-making at this level. Rather, politicians use moral sophistry to maintain an image of legitimacy, justifying its malevolent action. My argument is based upon the universal truth that no capitalist state, or any type of state for that matter, has given up power willingly without some reward. States have only seized power. This is the same reason why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seems doomed to go on forever. Israel holds the vast majority of power in the interaction, and is therefore unwilling to come to any agreement that would increase the power of Palestinian leaders, simply because they don't have to. Their alternative to negotiation is business as usual, a much more favorable end for the Israelis. So they go on exploiting. Capitalist states make attempts to justify their actions to their citizens in order to create the illusion of democracy, when in fact, these wars are decided for us. As Michel Foucault has taught us, by and by, it's more effective to control the thoughts of a people through rhetoric and propaganda, and lead them to one's desired conclusions, than it is to force a people to do something that they know is wrong. This is the reality of American foreign policy. Politicians accomplish this end by exaggerating and fabricating truths, providing half-baked political outlooks that cast a fog over reality. This fog has been getting thicker and thicker as the influence of money in US politics becomes absolute. These powers are insidious and clever, seeking new, more efficient ways to exploit. Since the rise of capitalism, the super-wealthy elite have employed appalling techniques in order to hoard wealth, from slavery to imperialism, from the war in Vietnam to the war on drugs. And it's through the utilization of this very fear by which war is generally accepted by the American public. All of which brings me to my conclusion. Since elections cannot be won in the United States without the monetary contributions of the corporate aristocracy, both political parties that fill our halls in Congress act as an instrument of the super wealthy. And since the interest of the state to increase its power abroad and the interest of the corporate aristocracy to hoard wealth are mutually advanced by engaging in warfare, the inevitability of war is built into the American capitalist system. War is an obligatory supplement to modern American capitalism. It is a tool of the super wealthy, used to further hoard the wealth at the cost of everyone from the extremely poor to the regular rich. And attempts to address the United States state of perpetual war will be fruitless until we first address the power structures that allow the corporate aristocracy to decide for us the trajectory of our democracy. One may wonder how corporate control of government could be maintained. Would the people's voting power not oust corporate cronies from the political ranks? What keeps the voters from rising up against these powers? In the last half-century, in particular, the corporate aristocracy has solicited politicians to utilize non-traditional wars to create a phantom menace within society itself, to convince the population to give up civil liberties in the name of safety. The use of fear in order to convince citizens to give up liberty is exactly what Stalin did in the Soviet Union to justify the Great Purges, and what Mao did in China to justify the Great Leap Forward. Now, the United States is using the fear of terrorists as its new invisible enemy. The war on terror is a convenient one. It's a war fought on all fronts, even within our own borders. And it is this exact notion, that of an invisible enemy, that is used as justification for much of the shady business that takes place in Washington and the Pentagon. It's been used as justification for entering Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been used to justify hundreds of drone strikes in Pakistan, resulting in thousands of civilian deaths. And it's even been used in at least one case to justify the assassination of a US citizen. Also, terrorism is the main cited justification of the Patriot Act, an invasive and unconstitutional piece of legislation that gives the government unprecedented power to surveil the private lives of US citizens. Certainly, the fear of terrorism has been used to justify even more insidious actions, but much of the United States' counterterrorism is done in secret, once again, for our own good. For one, by defining anyone who takes violent action against the United States for any reason as a terrorist, we avoid addressing the underlying issues of why these people become terrorists in the first place. Usually when the subject is brought up, their motivation is quickly written off as they hate our freedom, or something equally as irrational. In reality, it's not Americans the terrorists hate, it's not even America, but rather American foreign policy. Politicians know this. President Jimmy Carter lamented in a 1989 interview with the New York Times, "We sent Marines into Lebanon, and you only have to go to Lebanon to witness firsthand the intense hatred among many people for the United States. Because we bombed and shelled and unmercifully killed totally innocent villagers, women and children and farmers and housewives, in the villages around Beirut. And as a result of that, we became kind of a Satan in the minds of those who are deeply resentful." The reality is, killing civilians breeds terrorists, and it's perfectly rational. Ask yourself, how would you feel if a country drone struck your neighbor and your son's life was lost as collateral damage? Would you not hate the country that dropped that bomb? You'd be kidding yourself to say that you would not. But it's been a massive failure of the American public in not recognizing that this is what happens every day in the Middle East. Or rather, it's a massive success of politicians and lobbyists to convince us that we are liberators rather than despots. According to a study facilitated in 1997 by the Defense Science Board for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Technology, historical data show a strong correlation between U.S. involvement in international situations and an increase in terrorist attacks against the United States. So simply by involving ourselves in counter-terrorist activities abroad, we create a vicious, never-ending cycle in which more and more terrorists rise from the ashes of their dead brothers, sisters, and children. Once again, the US government knows this. Though they would have you think that they want a world eradicated of terrorists, in reality, they rely on the fear to justify violence, occupation, and the exploitation of foreign lands as a means of increasing their power, whilst the profiteers further hoard capital. Though radically different from what I've described as traditional war, the United States war on drugs, as waged by President Richard Nixon, has been no less volatile nor lethal than most any of the US military interventions. The war on drugs is similar to the war on terror in several important ways. First, it's a war that can never truly be eradicated. For every human society in recorded history has used psychotropic substances to some end. The drug use is static, but what varies is the way in which these societies grapple with its presence. Second, both the war on drugs and the war on terror systematically accrue a continuous and endless flow of tax dollars and filter them through the channels of the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex. In effect, redistributing wealth from the majority of Americans to a super wealthy elite. And third, the war on terror and the war on drugs both amass vast numbers of civilian casualties. The war on terror, defined as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, had accumulated a toll of over 132,000 civilian deaths between 2001 and 2011, as compared to 6,518 US military deaths, according to a Brown University study. These disparities are wide and unconscionable. And recently, Mexico estimated the death toll of its own drug war to be 48,000 as of 2011, which, though not directly due to US military intervention, is pivotally associated with US drug policy. But an important factor of the United States drug war is its responsibility for bringing about the largest prison population of any country in the entire world. The United States holds only 5% of the world's inhabitants, but houses 25% of its inmates. 1/4 of the entire prison population of the world. is held in the United States. But there's another layer to this problem. Minorities, particularly blacks, are incarcerated at much higher rates than whites, despite all evidence pointing toward equivalent rates of drug use. Though blacks make up only 12% of the United States' total population, they make up 33.6% of all drug arrests. And to add a further layer, the aid elimination penalty of the Higher Education Act has been responsible for the denial of at least 200,000 requests for federal financial aid for students with prior drug convictions, which also disproportionately affects people of color. This phenomenon has come to be known as the new Jim Crow. So though the war on drugs may not have accrued as many casualties as the war on terror, it has demolished the quality of life and opportunity for a better future of a far larger group of people. And beyond the human aspect of the issue, we must also reconcile the economic effects of prohibition-centered policy. Last year marked the 40th anniversary of Nixon's war on drugs, and in that time, the US government has hemorrhaged in excess of $1 trillion toward the effort. $1 trillion. But where does this money go? The money goes toward the two largest interest groups that lobby our politicians against progressive drug policy reform: the police unions and the private prison lobbies. Pharmaceutical companies, alcohol companies, and medical marijuana growers are also opposed to the legalization and decriminalization initiative. It does not take long to connect the dots and see why these interest groups would lobby against reform. The police unions receive bloated grants from both the state and federal level for success in arresting drug criminals. Also, any money seized during a drug arrest is fed back into the precinct responsible for making that arrest. The private prisons, of course, benefit from the massive prison budgets that are fed into the prison industrial complex to make room for an ever-increasing number of nonviolent drug offenders. To put it into perspective, there are more people in jail today for drug offenses alone than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Tragically, as a result of powerful special interests buying influence in our congressional houses, the United States is engaged in one of the most morally and ethically bankrupt endeavors the world has ever seen. The war on drugs effect is exactly what was intended by those who waged it. Systematic redistribution of wealth up the ladder, padding the pockets of billionaires who pay minuscule rates on their income due to a grossly regressive tax code and widespread practice of money hiding. So in conclusion, the deck is stacked. Systems in place guarantee the continued use of war as a means of gaining power, either by way of money or world influence, simply because it's so effective at generating both. Tony Kushner, American playwright, cleverly creates a fictional character dubbed the world's oldest Bolshevik in his play Angels in America, Part 2, Perestroika, and uses the character to convey the danger of proceeding through history without true praxis, without theory. The old Bolshevik questions a funeral procession. The great question before us is, are we doomed? The great question before us is, will the past release us? The great question before us is, can we change? In time. And we all desire that change will come. And theory. How are we to proceed without theory? What system of thought have these reformers to present to this mad, swirling, planetary disorganization? To the inevident welter of fact, event, phenomenon, calamity? Do they have, as we did, a beautiful theory, as bold, as grand, as comprehensive a construct? You can't imagine the grandeur of the prospect we gazed upon. I weep for you. And what have you to offer now, children of this theory? What have you to offer in its place? Market incentives? American cheeseburgers? Watered-down Bucharinite stopgap makeshift capitalism? Pygmy children of a gigantic race? Change. Yes, change. Only show me the theory, and I will be at the barricades. Show me the book of the next beautiful theory, and I promise you, these blind eyes will see again, just to read it, to devour that text. Show me the words that will reorder the world, or else keep silent. If the snake sheds his skin before the new skin is ready, naked he will be in the world, prey to the forces of chaos. Without his skin, he will be dismantled, lose coherence, and die. Have you, my little serpents, a new skin? The current condition of U.S. politics is this man's fear realized. It is an example of a state void of theory, void of any real ideology. All that exists is membership to a party. Two organizations defined in a dichotomy, and like all dichotomies, it's a fiction. In reality, they are composed of the same interests. The lines between the Democrats and the Republicans are exact and imaginary. No way forward can include this sad manifestation of political party. Just as heightened consciousness led to the end of imperialism, a heightened consciousness is also required to end corporate ownership of our government. I believe that this end can only be brought about through revolution. However, a violent revolution would be impractical, as the military is far too mighty for any civilian force to reckon with. Also, the linked togetherness of the post-internet world has led to a never-before-seen wave of surveillance by the government, rendering any attempt at a coup doomed to be shut down before it's ever realized. I will take it one step further and argue that a violent revolution would also be undesirable on ethical grounds. For an end is only as just as the means used to reach that end. Any state formed out of the ashes of a violent revolution would have the blood of countless innocents on its hands, hence making that state illegitimate and doomed to fail as a result of its own hypocrisy, or perhaps to be conquered by the next tyrant. It's pivotal to understand that this is not a political end. It transcends the political. It's a humanist vision. What we must see is a social revolution, not so unlike the one seen in America in the 1960s, but it must be vaster in scope, and it must transcend all categories, gender and race and class at the side, leaving room for only true love for fellow living creature in earth. It's the same state of ascension meant to be realized by the capitalist free market or the communist post-revolution anarcho-communism. But these are both utopian ends. Neither of them can be realized. I disagree with the old Bolsheviks' assertion that a new theory is necessary before we proceed, when right before us we have two theories that are yin and yang, of equal and opposite evil, equal and opposite benevolence. The capitalist praxis of individualism gave birth to the critically important civil liberties enjoyed by many countries throughout the world. But their fetishism of capital has led invariably to rampant systematic inequality and war. The communist practice of collectivism led to a beautiful ascension of consciousness, shifting away from the individual and toward an interwoven web of humans, greater. However, despite the sincerest intentions of its devotees, every practical application of communism has been wrought with tyranny and bloodshed. So what must we do? The best that we can do as humans is find the golden mean. We must learn to embrace the best of both available theories. The populist spirit of communism, paired with the classic liberals' respect and dignity for the individual's will to be free. The communist awareness of the shared fate of all living things, paired with the capitalist drive and innovation that has led to the improvement of living conditions worldwide. These ideas are compatible, but they cannot be synthesized until we break our minds free of the old methods of division. The categories imposed upon us by the various manifestations of exploiters worldwide. Those categories which have been used as a smokescreen to camouflage their exploitation. Religion, race, gender, class, caste. All the great divisors of humankind throughout history must be left to the wayside. Only then can human be embraced. Only then will exploitation end. Only then will true human potential be realized. What this post-society world will look like, I do not know. I'm not as confident as Marx or Hayek in that regard. I do not even know if this revolution will come to pass. But what I do know, the United States' vulgar and inequitable capitalism carries deep within it the seeds of its own deconstruction. And before too long, the hypocrisy of the system will be brought to light one final time. Capitalism cannot and will not continue down this path forever. Its doom is part of its very being. It will be reconciled.